Hey everyone, welcome to this deep dive. And today we're going to be looking at NVIDIA and their upcoming Q3 earnings report. There's been a lot of market volatility lately. And, with all these analyst predictions flying around, I think it's time we try to make sense of it all.
Yeah, no, absolutely. There's just so much speculation. It's not even just about whether or not they beat expectations, but how the market's going to react,
Yeah.
even if the numbers are great.
So they could like totally crush it and still
That,
kind of fall flat.
right,
Now,
exactly.
why is that?
Well, I think to really understand that, we kind of have to zoom out a little bit and look at the broader U.S. market, right? We've got like these three big themes that are kind of all vying for investor attention right now.
Okay.
You've got stocks that are related to the upcoming election.
Mm.
You've got companies that are benefiting from the AI boom. And then you've got companies that are positioned to do well, during the holiday season.
So it's like a three-way tug of war.
Yeah,
So
exactly.
how does that impact a company like NVIDIA, which is like pretty clearly in that AI space?
Yeah, think of it like a seesaw. When one theme is kind of rallying and attracting a lot of investment, the others tend to consolidate.
Okay.
So their stock prices might move sideways a bit, not really gaining or losing much ground, while investors are kind of waiting to see what happens next. And right now, the market is being pretty cautious overall. You've got rising U.S. Treasury yields, and that's making investors a little bit hesitant.
Yeah, that makes sense. So even if NVIDIA delivers amazing results, the broader market might just be like, yeah,
It's definitely a possibility.
that's kind of a bummer.
Huh?
Let's talk a little bit about the semiconductor sector where NVIDIA plays. What's the outlook there?
So there's definitely some uncertainty in the air right now, particularly around the semiconductor companies that aren't really directly tied to the AI craze. We've got lingering concerns about U.S. consumer demand, and then you've got the evolving tech policies towards China. It's all just adding another layer of complexity.
Geopolitics.
Mhm.
Always got to love them.
Right. And on top of that, investor focus is shifting more and more towards holiday season beneficiaries. All of this is pointing to a potential period of consolidation for the non-AI semiconductor space.
Okay, so maybe not the most exciting time to be a non-AI chip maker. But is there a silver lining here? Could this actually be like a sneaky buying opportunity?
That's a really good point. For investors who are thinking long term, this could actually be a chance to grab shares of some really high quality semiconductor companies at, a potentially lower price, especially if their earnings suggest that, things are starting to bottom out.
Okay, that's interesting. But let's zoom back in on NVIDIA and those Q3 earnings that everybody's talking about. What are the analysts saying overall?
Generally, there is a lot of optimism, but got to remember that expectations are already incredibly high. Analysts are projecting revenue to be around like $32.9 billion, which would be an 82% growth compared to the same quarter last year.
Wow, 82%. That's a lot. But you mentioned earlier that they could do well and still disappoint. Can you break down this sell the news thing a little bit more?
Yeah, so sometimes a stock price gets bid up in anticipation of good news. And then even if the news is positive, maybe even beats expectations, investors decide to just, sell and lock in their profits. This can lead to a dip in the stock price, even though the company performed well.
Okay, so even good news can be bad news sometimes.
In a way, yeah.
Is that a likely scenario for NVIDIA, do you think?
It's definitely possible. NVIDIA themselves have guided for Q3 revenue of around $32.5 billion. So the market expectations are just slightly above that. To really impress Wall Street, they'd have to blow those numbers out of the water.
The pressure's on. But, we are talking about NVIDIA. They're known for innovation and exceeding expectations. What are some of the potential roadblocks they might face?
Well, supply chain constraints continue to be a headache for a lot of tech companies, and NVIDIA is no exception. Securing enough components to meet that, really intense demand, it's a big challenge.
Yeah, haven't we been hearing about supply chain issues for years now? Is this ever going to end?
Well, it's a persistent problem, especially in the fast-paced tech world. And for NVIDIA specifically, there are some whispers about potential delays in shipments for their Blackwell processors, apparently due to some design modifications.
Ah, yes, Blackwell, the new flagship GPU,
Exactly.
the game changer for AI.
Yeah.
And, on top of that, there's also some uncertainty stemming from issues with some of their partners, like Supermicro. They've had some earnings hiccups recently.
They have.
And that kind of raises concerns about the overall, supply chain. Okay, so we've got high expectations, we've got supply chain headaches, we've got potential partner problems. What's the worst case scenario here?
So some analysts are worried that even if NVIDIA meets or slightly exceeds those expectations, The current stock price might not be justified. Their valuation is very high. And if the broader U.S. market experiences a correction, NVIDIA could be vulnerable to a sell-off as large investors decide to just take profits and move on.
So it's like a double whammy. The company itself might not deliver a big enough surprise, and then the overall market could kind of drag them down even further.
It's definitely something to consider.
Not exactly what investors want to hear. But before we get too gloomy, surely there are some reasons to be optimistic about NVIDIA's future, right?
Oh, absolutely. While there are those short-term concerns, the long-term outlook for NVIDIA is actually quite bright. We'll dive into all those reasons in part 2 of this deep dive. Stay tuned.
Sounds good. Looking forward to it. Okay, so we just talked about some of the potential risks for NVIDIA, but now let's shift gears and talk about why people are still so excited about them. What's got you feeling good about their long-term prospects?
Well, let's go back to those Blackwell GPUs for a second. Even with those potential shipment delays in the short term, they're still anticipated to be a major growth driver for NVIDIA, especially starting in Q4 and beyond.
Okay, so once they get the supply chain issues sorted out, it's off to the races. Remind me again, why is everyone so hyped about Blackwell?
Right, so it's their next generation GPU, and it's really designed to power those super demanding AI applications. We're talking, full-scale production of Blackwell is projected to bring in massive revenue for NVIDIA. Some analysts are even predicting that by Q4 of fiscal year 2025, NVIDIA's revenue could hit $36.61 billion. That's a year-over-year increase of over 65%.
Wow, that's huge. So it's not just a one-time bump. It sounds like this growth is going to continue.
Exactly, and a lot of that is going to be fueled by those high-margin data center sales. If you look at, the first half of fiscal year 2025, their revenue is estimated to reach like $56.08 billion with a 68% operating margin.
Okay, now those are some impressive numbers. Can they keep up this incredible pace, though? Like, what's really been driving their financial performance?
One thing that's really interesting is how much their profit margins have grown over the past 5 years. If you go back to like fiscal year 2020, their profit margin was 34%. And now in fiscal year 2024, it's 61%. That's a compound annual growth rate of like 75%.
75%? That's amazing. So basically, for every dollar they're bringing in, they're keeping way more of it as profit now.
Yeah, pretty much.
What's driving that?
Well, a lot of this growth has been fueled by, that insatiable demand for AI-related technologies. As more and more companies are investing in AI infrastructure and models, they need increasingly powerful GPUs, and NVIDIA is really the leader in that market.
They've kind of got it cornered, haven't they?
Yeah.
Like, how much of the market do they actually control?
Yeah, they've got a pretty dominant market share. It's estimated to be around 95% for those AI training and inference chips that are used in data centers. And with companies like, xAI, Meta, Microsoft all pouring money into AI development, that demand's only going to increase.
So they're not just riding the AI wave, they're like the ones making the surfboard.
Yeah.
All right, let's go back to those Blackwell chips for a second. You mentioned some revenue projections. Can you give us a little more detail on those?
Sure. So if we look at shipment volumes, production is expected to ramp up significantly in Q4 of fiscal year 2024. Estimates are somewhere between 150,000 to 200,000 units shipped. And then by Q1 of fiscal year 2025, that number could jump to like 500,000 to 550,000 units.
So a potential growth rate of like 200 to 250,000 units per quarter. Wow, those are some serious numbers. How much revenue could that translate into?
Well, the price range for a Blackwell chip is estimated to be between $30,000 and $40,000 each. So across those 2 quarters, we could be looking at like up to $30 billion just from the Blackwell chip alone.
30 billion. Now that's a game changer. Are there any analysts kind of backing up this incredible revenue potential?
It's not just hype. There are actually some serious projections out there. For example, Morgan Stanley is projecting Blackwell chip revenue to be around $5 to $6 billion just in Q4.
So it's not even just about the numbers themselves. It's about how this chip could potentially impact like the entire AI landscape. What are other analysts saying about Blackwell and its potential?
Well, Goldman Sachs, they think that NVIDIA's next big earnings surge will happen in Q1 of fiscal year 2025. And that's going to be driven by both the Blackwell architecture and those anticipated improvements in the supply chain.
So once those supply chain issues get smoothed out, NVIDIA's earnings could really take off. It sounds like they're on the verge of something really special.
Yeah, I think that's the general consensus. It suggests that, all this market anxiety surrounding NVIDIA right now, it might just be short-term noise. The long-term outlook is still incredibly strong.
Okay, I'm starting to feel that bullish energy again. Let's talk a little bit about some of the price targets that analysts are setting for NVIDIA. What are the experts predicting?
Well, we've seen a number of target price increases recently. Piper Sandler raised theirs to $175, citing NVIDIA's dominant position in the AI accelerator market. And, that strong demand for Blackwell, Milius Research went even higher. They set their target at $185.
185. They're really bullish on NVIDIA. What's their reasoning for such a high target?
Well, they're drawing comparisons to the early days of the iPhone. They're suggesting that what we're seeing now is, the beginning of a similar wave of innovation and growth driven by AI. And of course, NVIDIA is playing a huge role in that.
Okay, that's a bold comparison. What about some of the more conservative projections?
Well, FactSet Visible Alpha has a target of $165, which is
Whoa.
still pretty optimistic. They note that NVIDIA's price-to-earnings ratio, which is a key metric for valuing companies, is currently below its historical median. So that suggests there's still some room for the stock price to grow.
So even the more cautious analysts are still betting on NVIDIA's success. What about the big banks? What are they saying about NVIDIA's future?
Wells Fargo's Aaron Rakers, he's maintaining a buy rating on the stock. He's projecting data center revenue to exceed those market forecasts, potentially reaching like $30 to $30.5 billion. He's especially excited about the Blackwell platform and its potential to significantly increase NVIDIA's revenue overall.
Sounds like Blackwell is really the key here. What about some of the other major banks?
Bank of America, they're even more bullish. They're projecting that NVIDIA could generate around $200 billion in free cash flow over the next 2 years.
200 billion. To put that in perspective, that's like more than the entire market cap of a lot of Fortune 500 companies. What's their reasoning for such a wild prediction?
Well, their argument is that, with the rapid growth in AI model demand, we need more and more computational power, and NVIDIA is really the only company that can deliver that. Every new, more advanced AI model is pushing the boundaries of what's possible, and that translates into continued demand for NVIDIA's high-performance chips.
So they're not just keeping up with the AI wave, they're like the ones driving it forward. What about some of the other analysts who have maybe a slightly more grounded perspective?
Even Morgan Stanley, who have a more modest target price of $160, they still believe that the strong demand for Blackwell is going to fuel momentum in the AI market. They point out that orders for the chip are already secured through October 2025, so that reflects stable and predictable demand, at least for the foreseeable future.
So we've got a range of target prices from a more conservative $160 to a very bullish $185. But they all seem to be pointing in a positive direction. Now let's talk about the big money players, the hedge funds. What are they doing with their NVIDIA holdings?
Ah, yes, hedge fund activity. Always interesting to watch. So the largest hedge fund holder of NVIDIA is Ken Fisher of Fisher Asset Management.
Oh yeah, he's a legend. Is he buying or selling?
He's definitely in the bullish camp. He currently holds around 93.44 million shares of NVIDIA. And what's interesting is that he actually increased his holdings by about 2.1 million shares in Q2. So his total holding value is estimated to be around $11.54 billion, with an average purchase cost of $11.45 per share.
11.45 a share.
Yeah.
Man, talk about a steal. But haven't we also heard about other hedge funds kind of reducing their positions in NVIDIA? It seems like we're getting some mixed signals here.
You're right. There have been some notable moves on the sell side. Large funds like Citadel and D.E. Shaw have reduced their NVIDIA holdings recently. In fact, last quarter, hedge funds on average reduced their NVDA holdings by 9.1 million shares.
So we've got Ken Fisher doubling down while others are cashing out. It's a little confusing. What's your take on these kind of contradictory moves?
Well, it's important to remember that hedge funds, they all have different strategies, different risk tolerances, different investment horizons. Some might be taking profits after, NVIDIA's really impressive run up this year. Maybe they're thinking, hey, we've made a good return, let's lock in some of those gains. Others might be rebalancing their portfolios to diversify their holdings, or they might be shifting their focus to other sectors they think are, poised for growth.
So these sell-offs don't necessarily mean those hedge funds are like losing faith in NVIDIA. It could just be a matter of, managing their overall portfolio and risk.
Exactly.
Okay, that makes sense. But with all this kind of conflicting information, bullish analysts, some hedge funds buying, some selling, how are we supposed to interpret all this as we get closer to NVIDIA's earnings release?
Well, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
It definitely feels that way. Like trying to solve a puzzle with some of the pieces missing.
Yeah, but I think the key is to remember that there are these two distinct perspectives on NVIDIA, the short term and the long term. In the short term, we should probably expect some volatility. The stock's had a great run this year, and as we talked about earlier, there's always the possibility of that sell the news reaction, even if the earnings are good.
So short-term investors might be in for a bumpy ride.
Yeah, it's possible, but for those long-term investors, the picture looks a lot different. NVIDIA is at the forefront of this whole AI revolution, and they're in a really good position for continued growth in a market that's only getting bigger and more important.
So if you're in it for the long haul, those short-term ups and downs might not be as much of a concern. What's your final piece of advice for our listeners as we head into this earnings release?
Well, I think it's important to remember that earnings reports, they're just one data point. Don't get so caught up in that short-term noise that you lose sight of the bigger picture. Focus on those long-term growth drivers we've been discussing. NVIDIA's dominance in the AI chip market, their innovative products, and that growing demand for AI solutions across all sorts of industries.
So don't panic if the stock takes a dip right after the earnings announcement. Just keep your eyes on the prize, which is NVIDIA's long-term potential.
Exactly.
Now, before we move on to some more practical tips for navigating this earnings release, let's take a look at one final piece of the puzzle: NVIDIA's historical performance in November.
Yes, seasonality. It's a really fascinating part of market analysis.
Yeah, some companies just tend to do better or worse during certain times of the year. So tell me, does NVIDIA have a history of performing well in November?
Well, if you look at the historical monthly data, there's a 77% probability of positive returns for NVIDIA in November. 77%. That's pretty good odds. So even with all the uncertainties surrounding this upcoming report, history suggests that NVIDIA might still surprise us.
It's definitely possible, and that's what makes the stock market so exciting. Even with all the analysis and predictions, there's always that element of unpredictability.
That's why they call it a gamble, right?
Well, I think we've covered a lot of ground in this part of our deep dive. We've explored the bullish arguments, the potential risks, and, the overall excitement surrounding NVIDIA's long-term future.
Okay, so we've gone over the bull case for NVIDIA, and we've looked at the potential risks, and we've even dug into those historical trends. But now I think it's time to get really practical. How can our listeners actually use all this info, to make smart decisions as we head into this earnings release?
That's the important part, right? It's one thing to understand all the analysis, but then you have to actually apply it and make some choices.
Exactly. We don't want to just overwhelm people with data. We want to actually help them use it.
Right.
So let's start with, the big picture here.
What's your advice for listeners who are maybe a little more risk averse?
I think if you're someone who's not really comfortable with, huge swings in your portfolio, or if you've already got a lot invested in NVIDIA, it might be a good idea to think about reducing your exposure a little bit before the earnings come out.
Reduce exposure meaning what? Like specifically?
Well, it could mean selling some of your shares to lock in some of those profits you've made. Or maybe look into hedging your bets with some option strategies. That can help limit potential losses if the stock price takes a dip.
So don't put all your eggs in one basket, especially when that basket's about to get shaken up a bit.
Exactly.
Okay, that makes sense. Now, what about investors who are a bit more, comfortable with risk and who are maybe still really bullish on NVIDIA's long-term potential? What's your advice for them?
Well, for those folks, all this volatility could actually be a good thing. If the stock dips after the earnings, even if the numbers are good, it might be a chance to buy in at a lower price.
The classic buy the dip strategy. But that takes some guts.
Yeah.
I got to have a lot of faith in the company.
Yeah, you have to be willing to ride out those short-term losses and have confidence that the stock will rebound and grow over time.
So we've got two main approaches, kind of. Play it safe if you're risk averse, or maybe try to buy the dip if you're feeling bold. What other advice would you give to our listeners as they get ready for this earnings announcement?
I think it's really crucial to remember that earnings reports are just one piece of the puzzle. Don't get so fixated on those short-term market reactions that you lose sight of the bigger picture. Focus on those long-term growth drivers we've been talking about. NVIDIA's dominance in the AI chip market, their constant innovation, and that ever-growing demand for AI-powered solutions everywhere.
So don't freak out if the stock doesn't, immediately skyrocket after the numbers come out. Just keep your eye on that long-term prize, which is NVIDIA's potential in this whole AI space.
Yeah, exactly. And remember, the stock market is always trying to predict the future, so even if NVIDIA delivers a fantastic earnings report, the market might already be factoring that in.
Right. It's like trying to outsmart everyone else who's also trying to outsmart everyone else.
Pretty much.
It's a tough game. So stay focused on your own goals and don't get too caught up in the day-to-day drama. All right, as we wrap up this deep dive into NVIDIA's earnings, I want to leave our listeners with a question. What do you think the future holds for NVIDIA as this AI landscape keeps evolving? It's changing so fast.
That's a great question. And it's one that everyone in tech is trying to figure out. We've seen how NVIDIA has really capitalized on these early stages of the AI revolution, but things are still developing. It's not over yet. New competitors are going to pop up, new technologies are going to emerge, and the demand for AI solutions will only get more complex.
So NVIDIA's got to stay ahead of the curve, right?
Sure.
Keep innovating and delivering those groundbreaking products.
You.
And that's what makes them such a fascinating company to follow, right? And
Yeah,
they're not just along for the ride. They're shaping the future of AI.
I agree.
And I have a feeling the next chapter is going to be even more exciting.
Me too.
Well, we've covered a ton of ground today, but this is really just the start of the conversation. So we want to hear from you. What are your thoughts on NVIDIA? What do you think their future looks like? Share your predictions and insights with us. And until next time, happy investing.